He's done a lot of great corporate work and everything else. I'm really pleased to have him part of the Blockchain Summit here. And go ahead, Bob, take it away.
Thank you very much, John. Well, it's a true treat to be here on 420 at almost 420, to be back in the almost 2 Mile High city. I spent 20 years here, originally brought here by a company called Jeppesen. For their systems, I was the chief designer and architect to the systems that supplied the data that goes into the flight management systems that take off and land aircraft. And to clear up some of the confusion in terms of who Don Tapscott is versus Bob Tapscott, is when that system went live, my brother, who is an author of many books and a world-renowned speaker, and who's on a jet 3 times a week, I phoned him immediately and said, for God's sake, stay off aircraft until we get the bugs out of this thing. There are a couple of things I'd like to try to accomplish in this speech. One of which is to try to give a perspective historically in terms of why we're looking at likely the greatest transformation to occur in the last 2,000 years. So first of all, my brother Don set up what's called the Blockchain Research Institute. And what we do is we consult to, as you can see, companies such as KPMG, Capgemini, Accenture, IBM, SAP, and others. So we consult the companies on how to consult on the blockchain. There are some forces that are converging that are relevant here, and I think some people get them confused, so I'm just going to try to differentiate between some of the concepts that we have here. Is in terms of blockchain is a trust protocol. It's a technology. Cryptocurrencies are tokens, or in effect today, real currencies that exist in the digital format on the blockchain. Is that, as far as I'm concerned, having been in banking for over 20 years, is that if there's a futures market, if you can deposit it and make interest on it, if you can exchange it for other currencies, in my opinion, things like Bitcoin are indeed a true currency. In terms of artificial intelligence, is in 1962, there was a competition between a program written in assembler on a tape operating system and the alleged world's greatest checkers player, and what do you know, the computer won, and everybody was shocked in the context of doing that. And when you write a program like that, that's what's called artificial intelligence. If you take a look at what happened in 1996 between Kasparov and IBM, DeepMind, Deep Blue, is they got together the best chess players in the world. They got some of the top programmers in the world. They made one of the largest supercomputers in the world. And collectively, they took on Kasparov in 1996 with a machine that could calculate 50,000 moves a second, and Kasparov beat it. In 1997, with a heck of a lot more code and a heck of a lot more hardware, what happened is after the first game with Kasparov, IBM and the chess team realized they were going to lose again because he changed his strategy. So with a whole bunch of modifications to the code, eventually when it was all over, it was 3.5 for Big Blue, and it was 2.5 for Kasparov. Deep learning is something that's completely different. And in deep learning, what happens is you get the computer to teach itself. You tell it the rules of chess, and then you give it some time, and what do you know? It's the best chess player in the world. And deep learning is something that is going to radically transform the world in which we live over the next period. Deep learning is heavily based on big data. Big data is being gathered by the Internet of Things, and we hope it's being done in a secure and trustworthy way, which ties back into the blockchain. So, as everyone knows here, if you can take call it an IPO, call it a Series A round, call it an idea, if you can throw the blockchain into it, its value goes up by tenfold. which is ridiculous. So just in the context of sort of a summary at the end of the convention here, is the blockchain, a trust protocol makes sense where there are multiple parties involved that lack trust. And in some ways, that was an argument I originally had with Don. Don said, no, this technology is so wonderful. You should implement it internally within your own organization where there is trust. It's just such a hot protocol, you should implement it. And I thought that was ridiculous. If you trust yourself, why would you not use SQL? Why would you not use a technology that was proven? And after much reflection, I went back and I thought about Arthur Andersen at Enron. And I don't know if people remembered what happened there, but Arthur Andersen went out of business, not because Enron was shady, not because their audit work was sloppy. They were put out of business because what they did is they'd gone back and falsified their records, which put them out of business. So there's a case where lack of trust in yourself is a possible, logical, sensible blockchain implementation. Clearly at the moment, in terms of many of the implementations, the performance issues, privacy is an issue that is in its infancy in the context of the implementation of a blockchain. But it is so clear that there are massive benefits through a trust protocol in terms of disintermediating organizations such as banks, in which we've historically had trust. So we have a perfect storm on our hands in terms of technology advancements, and I'll get into some of those a bit, and in terms of what happened in 2008 and the lack of trust we now have in institutions. And I don't know how well people remember the bank crisis, but the Federal Reserve turned on the fire hoses and poured $1 trillion into the banks here and $1 trillion into the banks there. And I don't know if you people realize it, but $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, soon that starts to add up to real money. And when it was over, the Federal Reserve put in $7.7 trillion to save the banks, which works out to about $40,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. And the other thing that's happening has to do with technology and the evolution of technology in terms of where processing is going, is that the critical processor in a computer used to be the i7 or the i9 chip that's inherent within it. And the processing is moving away from the KISS chips to the RISC chips that are in the graphics card. And anyone who's done any mining knows exactly what I'm talking about. So this was yesterday's payment model. And if I can just share you a personal story, is everyone is frustrated with the banks at how slow and inefficient it was. But I remember one time when I was a senior executive at Citibank Canada, the treasurer was my best friend, and I had an uncle who wanted to buy a horse in Florida. And he said that if I give you access to all of my CDs, depending on how much the horse is, can you cash in the appropriate ones and get money to me in Florida within 24 hours? So I said, piece of cake. So I sat down with the treasurer of Citibank Canada, and he said, piece of cake. Then we phoned senior people in New York, and 4 hours later realized we couldn't possibly do it. It was one of the most frustrating experiences I've ever had, because Citibank Canada at the time was an investment bank, and it was very used to moving around billions and millions of dollars. But moving around $10,000, it just had no idea how to do it. But if you take a typical transaction, a payment that's going from, say, the US to Europe, is bank number one takes a fee. It goes through the central bank here in the United States to a correspondent bank, which takes a fee. And so it's gone through the Fed, and it's coordinated through another system called CLS, which coordinates the movement across the Atlantic between the correspondent banks before it goes through the European Central Bank and ends up in the bank that you wanted to end up with less money. And there's basically $200 in fees that are calculated in the process. And you say, well, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. And it is ridiculous, it is absurd. But if you work in a bank, you realize that in every computer system, there are two operators checking what the other person does. There are two people involved in terms of introducing new code into the system, a maker-checker. In terms of the change to the program, there's a maker-checker in the context of that program to make sure that those changes are not nefarious. And on top of that, you have internal auditors that are verifying that all those processes are in place, that are checked by external auditors, that are checked by government auditors. And that's what's required to get trust in the system to work. And what do you know? It's a very expensive process. So today's payment mode is that with a trust protocol, you can, through the blockchain, make payments directly in a matter of minutes, as opposed to the typical weeks that a transatlantic transfer could take. And you can do it with almost little or no fees. So that is done in a distributed ledger with computers all over the world that are basically have the ledger and are rewarded through fees or through mining in the context of running that distributed, non-centrally controlled ledger. Which ends up, as we all know, in an immutable ledger called the blockchain. So here's an example case which can do a cell phone to cell phone payment as a whole. And that's the irony of it, is that there are about 3 billion people in the world that are unbanked, and literally 1 billion of those people have cell phones. So if you can set up a payment system that works on cell phones, you don't need the banks. You can disintermediate the financial institutions. So for things such as payments or supply chain management, in terms of connecting supply chains throughout the world, the trust protocol is incredibly useful. If you go back 400 years, is if you wanted to buy an apple, you could see the apple and they could see your coin, and it was very easy to establish trust. If, however, you wanted to do trade between Europe and the Far East, what was the trust protocol? And the answer was, the only way it worked is when you trusted yourself. So what was set up was called the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. And to get some idea of the size of these things, is the Dutch East India Company, by today's standards, is 10 times the size of Apple. So the only way to get international commerce working was by trusting yourself. And unfortunately, what happened to the British East India Company is that Robert Cleves, who was in charge of it in India, decided that opium was a more profitable business. And before he knew what happened, he had an army of 30,000 people that were trying to enforce his somewhat questionable ethics. And the country as a whole, the British government seized control of it. And to many historians, that was the beginning of the British Empire. So if we go back, this is the computer. In 1962, was able to beat the apparent world's champion checkers player. And as you can see, it's a relatively large thing. It's a tape operating system. But to me, what's fascinating about it is that not by design, but by today's definition, it's what you call a reduced instruction set computer. It had very few instructions because that's all you could design into it at the time. And I don't know if there are any people with gray hairs who can recognize this. Okay, this used to be the instruction set of the IBM computer in the 1960s, the 360. This was in the 70s, in the 1970s, and this is the instruction set on the 390 computer, which is basically the end of the mainframe era. And if you look closely, and these were focused, you can see over a 10-year period, they added one instruction in this column, plus a whole bunch of other instructions to move from real memory to virtual memory. This had a much bigger address space, and as you can see in the green, they've added some new instructions. Now, if you take a look at what's happened with the Intel chip, is year after year, chip after chip, they keep adding more instructions. So for instance, your computer is measured in gigahertz, and it'll take 50 of those hertz in the hardware to do a square root function, which is a long way from the original computers that could add, subtract, multiply, and divide until a number was greater than, less than, or equal to 0. So the chips have got massively complex in comparison. So back in the 1960s, I didn't read about it until the 1980s. The concept came up of what were called neural networks. And the idea was that you could take a look at something and say, first thing is it's round, it has ears, it has hair. Conclude maybe it's a cat. And if you set up what's called a neural network, and this is how 50 years ago, 60 years ago, people thought the human brain worked. In fact, they still think that's how the human brain works, is if you set up millions and millions of these neural networks, and you can get a processor that will run them at a reasonably fast speed, you're able to come up with something that's very similar to human thought. So if you take a look at the Intel chip, the high-end Intel chip, the i9, it has on it 18 processors, the most recent one, of which it has a virtual processor and a real processor. So it has a total of 36 processors. If you take a look at NVIDIA stock, which was basically a graphics card composed of thousands of RISC chips. And people discovered in the Bitcoin community is that for mining, this chip, running thousands of these chips simultaneously, made more sense than running on the main processor on the computer as a whole. So to give you an idea of the cost, for $150,000, you can buy an NVIDIA box that has 46,900 processors. And when you're mining, that's a heck of a lot more efficient than an i9 chip, than an Intel chip. And so to me, there's sort of like two ironies here, is that one, we went from RISC chips, because that's all we were capable of engineering, to these massively complicated chips, and now we're going back to RISC chips. And the other thing I think that's fascinating about it is that everyone gave up on neural networks in the 1980s. They were just too slow, they were just inefficient. And there was one professor at the University of Toronto who persisted, and in 2012, a couple of the students came up with, using neural networks, they came up with a natural language processor that simply stunned the world. And surprise, surprise, they're all now working at Google. You have computers now that in some ways are mimicking the actions of the human brain. There are a couple of differences though. Is that our human brain operates in a particular way, but it's based on chemical processes. And it has a speed of about 10,000 transactions a second. These computers have a couple of advantages, okay? One is to transfer what I know to my children. It takes over 20 years. And if you want to know the truth, I don't think I've done a perfect job. Is that to hook up a new computer, designed by a computer, to get access to the information the previous generation of computers had, it's a question of nanoseconds. So that's a big advantage. And two is their memories are a little better than ours. They're perfect. So what I'm saying is that maybe it's not this year, or this decade, or next decade. Personally, I think it's next decade, but there is no doubt, I think, that artificial intelligence engines will soon be more intelligent than most people. Now, getting into the big data business is big data. If I can just give you a simple example, is you can say, well, everyone's talking about self-driving trucks, self-driving cars. There's 3.5 million truck drivers out there. You take a look at their wages, you add in a few Uber drivers and some taxi drivers, and that's $500 billion a year business. And that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what artificial intelligence engines can do. So the race is on. The amount of money that's being put into neural networks, deep learning, and artificial intelligence is mind-boggling. And believe you me, they expect the results that come out of it to we human beings to be mind-boggling as well. So in terms of the blockchain, there was an experiment with the DAO. Well, what's happening is that as a function of the blockchain and other historical influences, the enterprise is being changed. Is the idea of having a 40-year career at an enterprise no longer exists. And if you go back to Ronald Coase, who in the 1920s posted an hypothesis, and his question was, why does the corporation exist? And his answer was because of transaction costs. Is that, as an example, for the Ford Motor Company, it was cheaper to set up their own steel mills and their own glass factories, because they weren't out there, and it was cheaper to do it internally than look to external suppliers. And eventually, when people realized that steel had many applications outside of cars, and glass as well, they eventually became independent industries. But within about 10 to 12 years, it's expected that organizations are going to be far less centralized, is that people are going to be acting more as autonomous agents, and it's expected that by the end of the 2020s, is that 50% of all employees will be independent contractors, working in decentralized, potentially autonomous enterprises. So why now? And it's a couple of different factors. One is lack of trust in institutions. Two is the combination of advances of old approaches to software merged with old approaches to hardware through data mining, coming into a perfect storm that is introducing a whole new class of intelligent computers. And the obvious other why now is the potential upside is in terms of trillions of dollars. So let's just take as a simple example self-driving cars. Is that everyone talks about this as if it's something in the future. Chevrolet has announced that in their 2019 model, they plan to commercialize a car that has no steering wheel, has no brakes, has no manual controls. And about 6 months ago, I was at a convention in Detroit, and I spoke right after this individual who said he was the CIO for the world's largest car seat manufacturer. And I thought about that for a second, and then I realized is that car seat design is going to have to change radically, because what used to happen in the back seat of a stationary 1957 Chevy is in 5 years going to be happening in the front seat of a 2022 Volvo on long drives. And I think demographically that could be interesting. Because it may answer the immigration debate in the United States. Because in 1969 there was this breakdown at Niagara Falls that took out the power to the entire East Coast. And the demographers noticed that when people had nothing to do for like 10 hours without power, there was a blip in the birth rate 9 months later. And I don't like making future predictions, but I expect the self-driving car is going to introduce a similar kind of blip. So the question is, will computers ever drive as well as humans? And I've talked to many humans who are completely convinced that this is impossible. Computers cannot possibly drive as well as they can. And you know, the classic example is there's a woman standing there in a brown coat, okay, wearing brown slacks with a brown purse, that, you know, let's make it complicated, that happens to have a pattern that's the texture of a telephone trunk, okay? How on earth, you know, a human can spot that easily, how on earth is a computer going to see that? And the answer to that is a computer is going to have a completely different approach. And the approach is when you drive into your neighborhood, you may realize that there's a house with kids that play with a ball, and it's a good idea to slow down. But in terms of these networked intelligent computers that are going to be cars, they're going to communicate with each other. And the fact that you know that neighborhood well, and there isn't a telephone pole there, is what the self-driving car is going to know, based on the 100 cars that have driven there in the neighborhood before. Will know whether or not that person was there or whether or not it was a pole. It's going to know whether or not that stop sign that was recently knocked down is a place where you should actually stop. So the cars are going to communicate with each other in such a way that it's going to radically redefine the definition of what driving is. So what will computers soon do better than people? And the thing is that these neural networks and big data approaches are based on data. So as an example, I'll give you a trivial example out of my past, is that when I was going to university, through some fluke I ended up a nuclear medicine technician. And it was soon learned in the hospital that I had a skill that nobody else in the hospital had. And that is, I could find a vein in anyone. And I was in the ICU, I was in the operating room. It's when nobody could find a vein, I could find the vein. And it was funny, 30 years later, I realized the truth of the matter. And the truth of the matter is, a healthy person, a vein is spongy. And an unhealthy person, it's visual. And when I was 18 years of age, I could put my eyeball half an inch from someone's arm and see a vein, and it had nothing to do with skill, it was simply my age. So if I can take that as a medical example, if they found in England that, believe it or not, 22-year-old kids that were gamers are better at quadruple bypass surgery than surgeons with 15 years of experience, with some just-in-time training. And the reason for that is better eye-hand coordination. And the thing that I think people, or some people, misunderstand or misinterpret is, you say, I've got 25 years of experience, clearly I'm going to be helpful in terms of teaching an AI computer how to be a doctor. And the answer to that is, it isn't interested in your skill. It's interested in data. So as an example, what they did was they fed into a computer, an AI computer system, pictures of tumors. And they asked it, based on the shape and the size of the tumor, what kind of progression they could expect. So they had historical data, they fed it into the computer, and the computer came back and told them that what was relevant was the characteristics of the healthy cell around the tumor. It had nothing to do with the shape or the size of the tumor, which shocked the people, because the computer came up with a hypothesis and a solution that humans hadn't even considered. When I was here 15 years ago, we were able to get to the point, and it's certainly much easier with planes than cars, is that computer systems could take off and land aircraft. The one thing that they couldn't do was talk to air traffic control, right? And so I'm not saying that AI engines and speech recognition are gonna make the difference, but the world is changing, and now instead of talking to an air traffic controller, they're transmitting information into the flight management system on board the aircraft. And with that, it will be relatively simple, very simple, to have an airplane that can take off and land without a pilot. So to me, this is one of the questions that you have to ask, is that if you feed into artificial intelligence engines, you find out that about 70 to 80% of the time, they're going to agree with a jury. And then if you take a close look at them, you find out that the computer is less influenced by the charisma of the particular lawyer. And so you can logically say, well, that makes perfect sense. You know, why don't we have computers as much for objective judges and juries? And then you think about it for a second, and then you have come to the conclusion that potentially a computer is going to sentence somebody to death. And that's a pretty scary possible supposition to arrive at. So, as an optimist, you say, wow, self-driving cars. Look at all the advantages. You can have a lane where the cars are driving 10 feet apart at 100 miles an hour. We're gonna go everywhere much, much quicker. My car is gonna be out making money me for all the time. It's gonna be out making money. I'm not gonna have a garage. I can reduce the housing crisis in Denver. I can turn it into a single family dwelling. It's going to be such a wonderful world. And there are many companies that are in the context of moving intelligence into the transportation business. It's a highly competitive industry. But in reality, Uber is out there to make money. And their losses are staggering. And believe you me, they're not planning, okay, to make it up by greater volume. Their whole business model is based on the assumption you get rid of the human being in the car. Okay, that's the only way they're gonna make money. So forget the idea of your car is gonna be out there making money. Other people have plans to have their cars out there doing money. Is that the #1 job in 47 out of 50 states is a truck driver. Within 5 years or 7 years, that could be an anachronism. So if you take a look at what the different predictions are out there, the WEF says within 2 years, 5% of all jobs are gone. Okay? McKinsey, 800 million by 2030. And the thing that's different about artificial intelligence is many other transformations in terms of technology have created jobs, but AI engines aren't interested in your opinion. They're not interested in your skill. They're interested in your historical data. And what is in some ways most disturbing about it is that the logic they come up with is generally very, very good, but it's not programmed. You have no idea how it came to the conclusion that it's come to. So AI could be a different experience. Now, if you take a look at some different people, John F. Kennedy felt that technology was one of the biggest threats of his administration to the US in terms that technology would create job displacement. He was clearly wrong, okay? There were a bunch of Nobel laureates in the 1960s that came to the very same conclusion. John Maynard Keynes, who was a famous economist from the 1930s, which is still highly regarded today. He was the one who had the theory, it actually was World War II, but his theory of how you got out of the Great Depression was, he told people what you had to do is you had to hire people to dig ditches. You had to deficit finance. And people would ask him, well, what happens if that doesn't work? And his answer was simple. He said, you hire more people to fill them back in. But basically, he's one of the chief theorists, and what he basically said is capitalism is based on the concept is that evil people pursuing evil goals will ultimately, collectively, end up in creating good things. So this time, are the concerns real? Historically, they haven't been. But I think this time may be different. Because if you go back to Tommy and the Who, his computers can now see you, they can hear you, and they can understand you. And there are a whole bunch of new technologies, spray technologies, that you can spray on things to have touch screens in effect. And as I was hearing from someone last night, is that they're setting up a health, it's funny. I described it as a healthcare system, and he argued that to some degree that was an oxymoron. But basically the concept is if you're sick, the first person you call is Watson. And Watson decides whether or not you should talk to a human being or you should take an aspirin and go back to bed. So thank you. Any questions?
Comment which maybe just place, maybe we'll think about it together, or for some reason when I listen to you about the last slide, I have this thought, and I know it's gonna sound like it's way off. Hopefully it will be generative of a discussion. I thought about how, for example, my children in a very progressive society, generally speaking, get sex education, but they don't get anything about relationships and intimacy. So this kind of divorce from the purpose of the technology, it is reminding me of that. Something that you are alluding to and saying what can go out of hand, and you're really being concerned and cautious. What can go out of hand with unleashing this technology without changing the human being with the application of technology, and having no culture of intimacy? And when I say intimacy, I mean the art of relating amongst ourselves, with the machine, and understanding the proper place of the machine. So this fear of the machine shouldn't be a threat to us if we knew the art of relating. So in terms of capitalism, in terms of sex education, in terms of any level of relating in the human society, what we need with the AI, I would like to hear what your sense of that is.
Gee, that's quite the question.
Can I add one more thing, Bob? Because
Certainly.
I think it's just one phrase, and this is branded, so don't go there. Civilization personalized. How do we get there in a civilization personalized is the most meaningful way, so that we don't have conversations, oh my God, the machines are gonna take us over, and if they take over, well, there will be no jobs. And yes, there's gonna be a lashback, but what kind of creativity, what kind of new bonding, what kind of intimacy, new culture of intimacy, what kind of capacities are gonna be unleashed simultaneously so that it's not threatening, but enabling?
There are a whole bunch of factors there's a confluence of factors that are coming into consideration. You can talk about, I was trying to explain through the history of computing, and the hardware part of the speech is that it's coming at us much faster than most people materialize. In fact, it's coming like 10 years faster than people thought 12 years ago. In fact, now they're saying the computers should have consciousness, self-awareness and consciousness within 15 years. But to answer your question, I think that the blockchain revolution is a social movement as well as a technological and economic impact. And when I was listening to some of the other speakers, it was pretty clear that many of them agreed that it was as well. So you've got to combine that in with what's happening in terms of social movements. The Me Too movement, for instance, is that I grew up in banks, which all of the top management was male, and all of the tellers in the branches were female. And that was accepted for whatever reason it was. And I think in some ways, some of the assumptions, the inherent assumptions on which society is based, are being challenged. And I think that we're going to go through a technological revolution as well as a social revolution. Now, in the context of how that's going to affect personal intimacy,